This is our television main event. Best 2 out of 3 falls, 30-minute time limit. On my right from Missouri, weighing 245 pounds, the Grappler.
Edward Len Denton was born August 25, 1958 in Houston, Texas, and lived in the small town of Humble, about 20 miles outside of Houston. Growing up, Denton's father was a big fan of Paul Bosch's Houston wrestling, but that love of pro wrestling did not transfer to Edward Len. While the young Denton was athletic and loved playing baseball, pro wrestling didn't interest him in the least. When Denton was barely 17 years old, his father worked in construction and remodeling, and took a job with a friend building a carport. The carport turned out to be for Tiger Conway Sr., who was in the last few years of an almost 20-year career in pro wrestling at that point. Both his father and his father's friend were excited about doing a job for a wrestling star they watched every Saturday night on TV, and encouraged Len to come with them to meet Conway. Denton refused at first, but finally gave in when his father put him to work helping with the carport so he would be getting paid. As it turned out, Denton and Conway Sr. became fast friends, and it wasn't long before Denton was at least thinking differently about pro wrestling. As far as trying pro wrestling, Denton was very much hesitant. This was largely due to the fact that he was small for pro wrestling standards, standing about 5'10" and weighing around 180 pounds. It didn't help when a man asked Conway one day if the sleeper hold was real, and Conway proved it to him by putting him in the sleeper and making him pass out. With the encouragement of his father, Denton went to an outlaw lucha libre promotion in the area, and actually started training. After only 2 weeks, they wanted to book him for his first match. Thinking that seemed too fast and he wasn't ready for his first match so soon, Denton talked to his father, who then called Conway Sr. Tiger asked Denton to meet him at the Sam Houston Coliseum the next day to see if he was ready for pro wrestling. Conway Sr. tried to stretch the young Denton, putting him in submission holds, which was a method used in discouraging someone from even trying to become a pro wrestler. Denton was on the smaller side, but he was also young and athletic. No matter what Conway Sr. tried to do to him to stretch him, it didn't work. To the point it angered Tiger, and he simply said he didn't feel comfortable trying to train him, and Denton was too small for the business anyway. Conway recommended Denton go into a different profession. Denton initially shrugged it off and started thinking about college, forgetting about pro wrestling. Denton's father, on the other hand, didn't let it go. Several days later, Denton's father approached him with an ad from TV Guide. It was for a wrestling school, run by a wrestler named Joe Pizza, who appeared on Houston cards through the 1950s and 60s. With his father leading the way, they went to the school to talk to Joe Pizza, who made it clear he didn't have high hopes for Denton's success. Pizza repeated the same concerns as Conway, saying Denton was too small and would never make it into business. But if he wanted to be trained, the cost would be $3,000. For some perspective on that, $3,000 in 1975 is the equivalent of almost $18,000 in 2024. Hearing for a second time he would never make it because he was too small made Denton mad. Denton told his father he was going to make the money to pay for the training and showed Joe Pizza he could do it. Denton spent the summer picking up extra work with his father as well as installing hot roofs. After saving enough money, Denton entered training at Pizza's school, where one of the other students attending happened to be Gary Young. All the students learned everything to get them started in the business, including how to build and set up a ring, though most of them would never make it in wrestling. After a year of training, Denton was helped by former Texas heavyweight champion Nick Kozak, who was semi-retired and working as a referee in Houston. Kozak contacted his brother Jerry, who was a promoter for the Funks in Amarillo, and secured Denton's first territory in Western States. Wrestling under his real name of Len Denton in Western States, Denton finally had his first official match on July 14, 1977, at the Sports Arena in Amarillo. Denton lost to Gary Starr in just under 7 minutes in that first match, but held Starr to a time-limit draw the next night at Fair Park Coliseum in Lubbock. Unfortunately, Denton's time working for the Funks would be short. Going through additional training with the Funks and given the typical rookie duty of driving Abdullah the Butcher to cards, Denton only lasted about 2 weeks in Amarillo. Booker Art Nelson let him go, again telling him he was too small for the business. Denton's journey into pro wrestling might have ended there if not for some history-changing advice from Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah told Denton to write a letter to Dory Funk Jr., thanking him for giving him a chance in the business, and asking if there was any way possible Funk Jr. could help him get booked somewhere else. The butcher added, "Don't give it to Art Nelson, seal it, and take it directly to Funk Jr.'s office." Denton did as Abdullah advised, and 2 days later he got word that Bill Watts had booked him in Louisiana. Watts had just taken over most of the tri-state territory from Leroy McGurk, including Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. It was a big territory with a lot of ground to cover, and most wrestlers didn't want to deal with a horrendous travel schedule. Watts just needed warm bodies to fill out a roster. A little over a month after leaving Amarillo, Denton had his first match in Tri-State, taking his first recorded win over another rookie, Larry Booker, at the Fairgrounds Coliseum in Jackson, Mississippi. Booker would go on to be known as Moondog Spot. Of course, outside of opening matches, Denton did a lot of losing to the stars in the territory as well. Later, Denton admitted he spent most of his first few months in the territory petrified because pro wrestling was indeed a big man's profession. Stepping in the ring with men the size of Killer Carl Cox and Sweet Hansen magnified that fact. Watts did not turn Denton away for being too small, but he was told, "Gain some weight and work for us, or lose some and work with Lord Littlebrook." Denton had befriended Porkchop Cash in the territory, a man that was the same height as he was, but had 21-inch arms to go with his 5'10" frame. It was Cash that showed Denton how to hit the weights to build size, and by the time the middle of 1978 rolled around, Denton had added 50 pounds to get his weight to reach a decent 230. As was typical at the time, wrestlers who were hoping to rise up the ranks traveled to different territories. In March of 1978, Porkchop Cash headed to Florida, and Denton went with him to gain experience. Using the name Len Denton, Florida was a good stop for the Texas native. At the time, the Florida territory concentrated more on athletic ability than size, and Denton settled in quickly. Denton mostly worked opening matches, but he did work his way into the lower mid-card at times, and even faced Jerry Briscoe for the Florida Television Championship on 2 occasions. By June, Bill Watts had arranged for Denton to go to Georgia, where Booker Ole Anderson was in need of talent for the undercard. That turned out to be the first step toward defining the rest of Denton's career. Arriving in Georgia in early June, Denton spent most of the first month in the territory working opening matches and jobbing to Angelo Mosca and Pez Whatley. During a TV taping in early July, Ole Anderson found himself short a wrestler. Taking a mask someone happened to have in their bag, Anderson handed it to Denton and said he needed him to wrestle twice on TV that day, once in the first hour and once in the second. For the first match, he could wear the mask and be announced as the Challenger, which was the name they came up with on the spot. Being the Challenger turned out to be a good way for Denton to make extra money, as he appeared several more times under the mask, including one Saturday when he wrestled twice on TV, 2 times each at 2 different venues later that day, and participated in a battle royal. Denton even got a taste of the upper mid-card as the Challenger when he tagged with Ole Anderson and Stan Hansen in Columbus, Georgia, and lost to Dick Slater, Thunderbolt Patterson, and Tommy Rich. In January 1979, Denton started splitting time between Georgia and the Mid-Atlantic Territory. Working for the Crockett's, Denton continued to pull the occasional double duty under the mask, as he did in Georgia. Denton was surrounded by amazing talent in Mid-Atlantic, but continued to work opening matches against other young wrestlers still trying to work their way up the card, like Don Kernodle and Jay Youngblood. By early February, Denton was working exclusively in Mid-Atlantic and caught what might have been a career-changing break, thanks to being randomly selected. Ric Flair was the reigning United States heavyweight champion at the time and the biggest draw in Mid-Atlantic. Shortly after returning from a tour of Japan, Flair lost his driver's license and wasn't able to drive himself to matches. For a reason that was never given, Flair chose Denton to drive him to matches while his license was suspended. That meant Denton would be in the opening match on the same card every time Flair wrestled, and even before his time as world champion, every card Flair was on sold out. Denton would not only be making more money, he was also getting the opportunity to pick Flair's brain and learn. Though there wasn't a lot of winning matches involved, Denton gained valuable experience through the rest of 1979. He was also making great money, earning $1,000 a week working opening matches. Later, Denton said it was the best time of his life hanging out with Ric Flair, who always provided women and booze, which an almost 21-year-old Len certainly wasn't against. By the end of summer 1979, Flair had his license back, and Denton was ready to move on with the experience he had gained. After spending a month in Germany, Denton returned to the U.S. for quick swims in the Memphis WCCW and back in Georgia, before landing in Calgary's Stampede Wrestling, where Denton got his first real push. Coming into Stampede Wrestling in January 1980, Dynamite Len Denton made it clear to fans he was there to go after Bret Hart, one of the top babyfaces in the territory, and the son of the legendary Stu Hart. When Hart returned at the end of the month, Denton got in the ring with the Calgary native for the first time at Exhibition Auditorium in Regina, Saskatchewan, in a tag match with the Stampede International Tag Championship on the line. Denton tagged with Bobby Bass against champions Bret and Keith Hart, with the match ending in a no contest when things got out of hand. Denton and Hart feuded through February and into March 1980, with Hart defeating Denton in a lumberjack match in Calgary, but Denton taking the win in a fight to the finish match in Edmonton. The feud turned out to be relatively short, with no real payoff. The last match featuring the two was another tag match, as Denton and Dynamite Kid defeated Bret Hart and Bruce Hart in Regina on April 29th. Hart would move into a program with Stampede North American champion Leo Burke, while Denton's time in Calgary came to an end, and he returned to Mid-Atlantic. During the month-long run in Mid-Atlantic, Denton made the decision to quit wrestling. After 3 years, he wasn't getting the big push he was hoping to get, and his new wife was from Charlotte, North Carolina. And Denton's plan was to stay in Mid-Atlantic for 8 months so his wife could spend as much time as possible with her family, then go back to Houston, where his father was going to teach him how to run his construction business, so Len could take it over. However, 2 things happened that changed the course of Denton's life. While riding matches with Don Kernodle, the topic of wearing a mask came up. Kernodle told Denton he would like to wear a mask and call himself the Grappler. Not surprisingly, Denton thought that was a good name. A few days later, while in Norfolk, Virginia, Denton was called into Gene Lewis's room and handed the phone to talk to Buck Robley, who was booking in the former Tri-State Territory, now known as Mid-South Wrestling. Robley told Denton he needed a masked wrestler and planned to give him a big push. Robley had seen Denton work in Georgia, and the spot was his if Denton wanted it. All he needed to know was what his name would be. Denton's answer: the Grappler. Once in Louisiana, the big push Robley promised wouldn't be right away. For several matches, the Grappler was just another mid-carder at spot shows, but he did win a tournament for the vacant Mississippi Heavyweight Championship to mark the first title win of Denton's career. For the record, that might have been a Rio de Janeiro-esque Bantam tournament, as there are no records of the actual tournament. Finally, the reason for the push being delayed became evident. Before a July 11, 1980 match in Shreveport, the Grappler's opponent Paul Orndorff risked getting fired by sneaking over from the babyface locker room to the heels locker room to talk to Denton. Orndorff let Denton know Bill Watts would be in the house that night for the sole purpose of watching their match. If he liked what he saw, Watts would not only give his go-ahead for the big push, but he would put the North American Heavyweight Championship on the Grappler. The Grappler and Orndorff brought the house down in a 30-minute time limit draw and left Watts impressed. Watts was going with the push for the Grappler, but he wanted to add a little something. In August, the Grappler began a series of title matches against Ted DiBiase for the North American Heavyweight Championship. DiBiase came out the winner in most of them, though they did wrestle to a time limit draw in a televised match. In a loss to DiBiase on August 18, 1980 in New Orleans, the Grappler suffered a leg injury, though it was a kayfabe injury and part of Watts' plan. After that match, the Grappler appeared on television wearing an orthopedic boot on his right foot, with a thicker sole than the other boot. Complete with a letter from his doctor, the Grappler claimed he suffered ligament damage in the match against DiBiase that made one leg slightly shorter than the other. A month later, on September 19, 1980, at Municipal Auditorium in Shreveport, the Grappler defeated Ted DiBiase to win the North American Championship, tapping the toe of his right boot on the mat before kicking DiBiase and putting him down. This, of course, was the origins of the Grappler's famous loaded boot. 3 years into a business he had no interest in 5 years earlier, the Grappler held 2 titles and was the top champion in the Mid-South Territory. Grappler successfully defended the North American title several times in return matches against Ted DiBiase until DiBiase left for Georgia that November. Grappler then entered into a brief feud with Killer Carl Cox, losing the Mississippi Championship to Cox on November 22, 1980, in a televised match in Shreveport. However, Grappler regained the title on January 31, 1981, in Greenville, Mississippi, to essentially close out the feud. And meanwhile, Grappler rolled along as the North American champion, defending the title against the likes of Jake Roberts, Jim Garvin, and the territory's top star, Junkyard Dog. Grappler also found himself rising in the ranks of the tag team division as the partner of Super Destroyer. On April 18, 1981, Grappler and Super Destroyer defeated Junkyard Dog and Dick Murdoch in a tournament final held at the Superdome in New Orleans to fill the vacant Mid-South Tag Team Championship, marking Grappler's first tag team belt. Grappler and Destroyer would only hold the titles 9 days before dropping the belts to Murdoch and Dog in a steel cage match at Municipal Auditorium in New Orleans, fanning the flames of a feud between the teams. Grappler and Dog seemed to be the center of the feud, with the two also facing off in several singles matches, including a dog collar match in Baton Rouge. And Denton found out firsthand how popular JYD was in Mid-South and how serious fans took things when he decided to jump JYD before a match started at a spot show. As he was taking it to Dog, he noticed a bunch of fans on one side scattering and diving under their seats. Denton knew that usually meant a fight had broken out in the crowd, so he just grabbed a hold on Dog and waited until everything calmed back down. As it turned out, it wasn't a fight. After the match, a police officer came to him and told him another police officer had decided to stay at ringside instead of going to the back, as was customary, because he wanted to get a closer look at that match. When Grappler jumped JYD before the bell, a fan pulled out the .357 Magnum. The officer was able to grab the fan before he got a shot off. Things were going so well with the Grappler and Destroyer tag team and the feud over the Mid-South tag titles, that's the direction Watts decided to go. On May 27, 1981, at a TV taping in Shreveport, Grappler lost the North American Championship to Jake Roberts. That ended his North American title reign at 250 days, which would be the third longest in the history of the title, and the longest by someone not named Bill Watts. Even without the belt, things were going well for Grappler in Mid-South, to the point that even Denton's father got into the business as he became a promoter for Houston Wrestling. When Denton's father was promoting a card in a small town in Texas, Denton made an appearance on the card as the Grappler. Bill Watts caught wind of it, and he was not happy. Mid-South TV ran in that town, and Watts felt Denton used his notoriety in Mid-South to help another promotion. Things got heated enough between Denton and Watts that when Ole Anderson, who was booking in Mid-Atlantic at the time, contacted Denton about working for Crockett, Denton pulled up stakes and went to the Carolinas. Anderson had promised big money, but it ended up being a lesson learned for Denton, as when he got to Mid-Atlantic, the money wasn't that big, and there really wasn't much of a push for him. When he brought this up to Anderson, Ole just said maybe he should have stayed in Mid-South. It didn't take long for Denton to put two and two together and realize Watts and Anderson had conspired to get him out of the territory. Even without the big money or a big push, Denton did well in Mid-Atlantic. Super Destroyer had gone with him, and they had a decent winning streak through September and October of 1981, leading to a match for the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championship where they lost to champions Chris Markoff and Nikolai Volkov. After his time in Mid-Atlantic, Grappler and Super Destroyer amicably parted ways, with Destroyer going to Georgia. Denton split time between Houston and Southwest Championship Wrestling in San Antonio, where he had brief feuds with Chavo Guerrero and Bruiser Brody. By the end of March 1982, Denton was back in Mid-South full-time. Probably because of his previous departure, the Grappler wasn't given the same push he had been given before, but he wasn't buried either. Now a part of Skandar Akbar's stable, Grappler teamed with the Assassin to go after the Mid-South Tag Team Championship, held by Junkyard Dog and Mr. Olympia. Meanwhile, the Grappler was in line for the Louisiana Heavyweight Championship, held by Junkyard Dog, and the Mississippi Heavyweight Championship, held by Mr. Olympia. The Grappler wouldn't win any of those belts, but after a tour of Japan in July and August, followed by a quick stint in Houston, Denton returned to Mid-South with a twist. In early September, Mr. Wrestling 2 appeared in Mid-South to announce he would serve as a special referee in a televised match for the Mid-South Tag Championship. Junkyard Dog and Mr. Olympia were to defend against Akbar stablemates Ted DiBiase and Jim Duggan. Fans with a good eye may have noticed the body didn't quite match up to the masked man people knew as Mr. Wrestling 2, and it wasn't the man they knew as Mr. Wrestling 2. It was the Grappler, masquerading as Mr. Wrestling 2. The day the titles were on the line, Denton as Wrestling 2 went on television to talk about the match when suddenly the real Wrestling 2 came out and attacked him. The fake Wrestling 2 ran to the back, while the real 2 stayed to convince Bill Watts he was the real Mr. Wrestling 2. The real 2 agreed to serve as special referee in the tag title match, to make sure no shenanigans took place. During the match, Jim Duggan tried to spear Junkyard Dog, but hit Wrestling 2 by mistake. With 2 down, the fake Wrestling 2 reemerged, loaded his boot on the apron, and kicked Wrestling 2, as DiBiase loaded his glove and hit JYD. The fake 2 then entered the ring and counted the pinfall. The victory and title change would not be recognized, and the belts returned to Olympia and JYD. The Grappler was exposed as being the imposter of Wrestling 2, but there was more deception coming. During a televised match between Wrestling 2 and the Grappler, 2 tried to take off Grappler's mask. In the tussle, the referee was knocked from the ring, and both wrestlers were down on the mat. Another masked Grappler came to the ring and tried to replace the one that had been in the match. However, the attempt backfired when Wrestling 2 was able to fight off both men. As it turned out, the man 2 had been wrestling was not the original Grappler, but someone that came to be known as the Grappler 2. The original Grappler was the man that tried to replace him. Fans wouldn't know, but the Grappler number 2 was actually Tony Anthony, who had been working opening matches in Mid-South the previous couple of months. The Grapplers feuded with Wrestling 2 through November of 1982, as Mr. Olympia also got involved in mask versus mask angles. Denton was working well with Anthony, but Anthony was still somewhat green, having been in the business less than 2 years, and Mid-South being his third territory. Denton took Anthony to Texas for a brief run in Houston, before the Grapplers moved on to Southwest Championship Wrestling in San Antonio. The Grapplers' time in San Antonio was relatively short, but they were involved in some of the more inventive storytelling in the territory. Arriving full-time in December of 1982 with Don Carson as their manager, the Grapplers defeated Ricky Morton and Ken Lucas for the Southwest Tag Team Championship on January 15, 1983, in San Antonio. That began a brief feud between the two teams that ended when Morton left the territory. The Grapplers actually lost the tag titles to Gino Hernandez and Tully Blanchard on March 21st, but Blanchard immediately turned on Hernandez and attacked him with one of the belts. The titles were vacated, and the Grapplers regained the belts on April 2nd in the tournament final against Bob Sweetan and Mando Guerrero. In early May, the Sheepherders, Jonathan Boyd and Luke Williams, came to Southwest Championship Wrestling demanding a match with the champions. The Grapplers manager Don Carson vehemently refused, but then suddenly relented, and the two teams faced each other with the titles on the line on May 5th in Corpus Christi. Having a reputation for being a violent team, the Sheepherders took advantage of the less experienced Grappler number 2, but when the original Grappler got in the ring, the Sheepherders were put back on their heels. While the Grapplers double-teamed Williams, Carson left Grappler's corner and walked around to Jonathan Boyd standing on the apron in the Sheepherders' corner. Carson handed Boyd a loaded glove, which he then used to knock out Grappler number 2, leading to a Sheepherders victory. In storyline, the Sheepherders called Don Carson and offered to make him their manager if he helped secure the titles for them. Of course, this wasn't known to the fans at the time. Knowing how tough Boyd and Williams were, Carson turned on the Grapplers, but it wasn't over yet. Once the match was over and the Sheepherders were given the belts, they then turned on Carson. Knowing they had been betrayed, the Grapplers left the ring and left Carson to be manhandled. That was also part of the swan song for the Grapplers in Southwest Championship Wrestling. They would wander around in the mid-card through April, but by May they reignited their feud with Ricky Morton and the Memphis-based CWA. In the CWA, Ricky Morton had teamed with Robert Gibson as the Rock and Roll Express. When the Grapplers came to Memphis in May, they immediately called out Morton, saying on television they had unfinished business and chased Morton all the way from Texas. Going from the podium into their first televised match, the Grapplers made short work of Robert Reed and a young Bobby Fulton by taking the win in 35 seconds. The Grapplers then started calling out the Rock and Roll Express before grabbing two more wrestlers who had come to ringside to help Reed and Fulton to the back and defeated them in an impromptu match. Finally, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson came to the ring and started what turned into 3 different locker room clearing brawls that saw Morton bleeding from the head and the Grappler number 2 almost have his mask removed. Even the local promoter came out to help break things up before the two teams were separated. It was a wild introduction to the Grapplers and their feud with the Rock and Roll Express. The Grapplers seemed to have the advantage early in the feud with wins and no disqualification matches. A new twist was put on things when the Grapplers began associating themselves with Jimmy Hart's first family, which included Jim Cornette as vice president of the group at that time. Eventually, the Grapplers became official members of the first family, though it may not have seemed like a good idea as Morton and Gibson defeated the Grapplers in a series of Texas death matches in late June and early July to essentially close out the feud, though it never really ended. Finally, the association with Hart's stable paid off when the Grapplers defeated the fabulous ones Steve Keirn and Stan Lane to win the AWA Southern Tag Team Championship on August 1, 1983, at Midsouth Coliseum in Memphis. Lane and Keirn insisted on a rematch with the stipulation that Grappler number 1 would not be allowed to wear his special boot, but the Grapplers did their best to dodge the Fabs. The dodging wouldn't have to go on for long, as the Grapplers dropped the tag titles to Dutch Mantell and Coco Ware on September 19th in Memphis. That also seemed to start some tension within the Hart stable going into the winter of 1983, with that tension increasing when stablemates the Bruise Brothers won the tag titles from Mantell and Ware. With Jimmy Hart seeing the Grapplers couldn't coexist with the Bruise Brothers, consisting of Dream Machine and Denton's old friend Pork Chop Cash, a match between the two teams was organized. The loser of the match would be out of the first family and no longer managed by Jimmy Hart. The two teams faced off on December 26, 1983 in Memphis, with the Grapplers being told by Hart he wanted it to be a scientific match with no cheating or bending the rules to prove which of the two teams was truly the best. When it became clear the Grapplers were the better wrestlers and likely going to win, Hart attacked Grappler number 1 first with a cane and then with a chain, but no avail. The Grapplers still won the match. However, it wouldn't make any difference. The Grapplers then quit the first family due to Hart's interference, leading to something of a babyface turn by the Grapplers, or at least making them tweeners for the short time they had left Memphis. A hair versus mask match was scheduled between the Grapplers and the Bruise Brothers as they went into 1984. Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett were splitting booking duties at the time and wanted the Grapplers to lose and unmask in front of the crowd at Mid-South Coliseum. Denton didn't like the idea and refused to lose his mask, saying Pork Chop and Graham better get used to having no hair. Lawler and Jarrett assured Denton they would have someone at ringside with a towel to cover their faces, but Denton sensed it wouldn't go as planned and insisted on a different ending, right up until they were at Mid-South Coliseum the night of the match. When Lawler and Jarrett came back to them with the same plan, Denton and Anthony gathered their things and walked out the front door of the Mid-South Coliseum. A few days later, they made their first appearance in Central States Wrestling. A small but key territory in the NWA at the time, Central States turned out to be an important one for Len Denton. Central States became the first territory where Denton took over duties as booker when Buck Robley needed a break and suggested him for the job. In the ring, the Grapplers wasted little time making waves in Kansas City, immediately entering a feud with Robley and Ron Ritchie, besting them in a Texas Tornado match in early March. The Grapplers also found themselves in the mix for the Central States Tag Team Championship, winning a tournament final for the vacant belts on March 29th against Jerry and Ted Oates. However, the titles were held up by the NWA when Grappler number 1 used his orthopedic boot in the match. NWA President Bob Geigel took possession of the boot, suspecting it had been loaded, coming on television to say they did not find the boot was loaded as such, but that it also shouldn't be used in the ring. In a televised match on April 5th, Jerry and Ted had Grappler number 1's boot on the ring post in their corner, while Grappler number 1 had a new orthopedic boot he wore in the ring. Late in the match, Jerry Oates took the boot from the ring post and hit the toe on the mat 3 times to load it, before striking Grappler number 1 with it as referee Sonny Myers was getting Grappler number 2 out of the ring. The Oates brothers won the tag titles while giving Grappler number 1 a taste of his own medicine. A week later, the Grapplers took the titles back, with Grappler number 1 again using the loaded boot and proving you couldn't stop the Grapplers, you could only slow them down. The Central States Tag Championship would be the centerpiece of the Grapplers' run through August 1984, while both Denton and Anthony also made appearances in NWA St. Louis and Maple Leaf Wrestling in Toronto. The Grapplers traded the tag titles back and forth with Marty Jannetty and Tommy Rogers, this Tommy Rogers, who would go on to be better known as Tommy Lane. The Grapplers finally lost the belts for the last time on August 23rd in Kansas City. In September 1984, Denton and Anthony made an unlikely return to Memphis, but this time the masks would be left in their bags. Possibly because of the way they left at the beginning of the year, Denton and Anthony returned to Memphis using their real names individually and being known as the Dirty White Boys as a team. Again managed by Jimmy Hart, the Dirty White Boys jumped into Hart's feuds against Jerry Lawler, Jimmy Valiant, and a recently turned babyface Rick Rude. It quickly became clear the Dirty White Boys were not going to get much of a push in Memphis and were only there to be part of an already existing feuds involving Hart. By January of 1985, Denton and Anthony had a falling out with Hart and storyline and entered into a brief feud with the First Family, leading to a loser leaves town match against the Terminators, which Denton and Anthony lost. Still maskless, Denton and Anthony headed to Mid-South, where they were farther up the card almost immediately, feuding with the Rock and Roll Express over the Mid-South Tag Team Championship. Denton and Anthony battled Morton and Gibson over the tag titles in May 1985, but never took the belts. In June, attention shifted to another feud as Denton and Anthony attacked Private Terry Daniels, sparking a series of matches between the DWB and Daniels with Sergeant Slaughter. The feud culminated in a no disqualification match against Daniels and former Marine Dick Murdoch, with Murdoch and Daniels winning. Denton and Anthony would go their separate ways after that Mid-South run. Anthony went to the Alabama-based Continental Championship Wrestling, and Denton once again donned the mask as the Grappler as he headed to Championship Wrestling from Florida. There was something of a callback early in Grappler's Florida run as he tagged with Rip Oliver in a long series of matches with Coco Samoa and Tiger Conway Jr. Of course, Conway Jr. was the son of the man that got Denton interested in wrestling 10 years earlier. Otherwise, it was something of an erratic 3-month stay in Florida. By October, the Grappler was ready to move on again, this time traveling to his home state of Texas and World Class Championship Wrestling. Making his World Class debut on October 18, 1985, the Grappler defeated Tommy Montana at the Sportatorium in Dallas in just under 7 minutes. Associated with Percy Pringle III's stable early on, Grappler found himself tagging with Pringle's men like Rick Rude and the Missing Link, but it would be in the singles division where Grappler made the most noise. After losing to Dave Peterson in the tournament final for the World Class Television Championship, Grappler entered a feud with Brian Adias over the Texas Heavyweight Championship. Grappler defeated Adias for the Texas title on December 9, 1985 at Will Rogers Coliseum in Fort Worth, and defeated Adias in rematches over the next several weeks, though Grappler and the Great Kabuki did come out on the losing end of a tag match against Adias and Iceman Parsons at the 1985 Christmas Star Wars in Dallas. Unfortunately, in hindsight, many people feel the Grappler was underutilized in World Class. Part of this may have been the timing, as World Class was preparing to break away from the National Wrestling Alliance, and did so in February 1986 when they created the World Class Wrestling Association. Shortly thereafter, the Grappler dropped the Texas Heavyweight Championship back to Brian Adias. 2 months later, Booker Ken Mantell abruptly left World Class for the Universal Wrestling Federation. The Grappler was stuck in mid-card matches, often with random tag team partners like John Tatum or Jerry Allen, and jobbing for the likes of Brickhouse Brown, Mark Youngblood, and Lance Von Erich. In June 1986, Rick Hazard, who at the time was known as a referee to World Class fans, donned a mask and took over as Grappler number 2 to begin a feud between the Grapplers and the Batten twins, Bart and Brad. That attempt was short-lived, and by the end of July, Hazard was back to being a full-time ref, with fans none the wiser. The Grappler began tagging regularly with Killer Tim Brooks going into 1987. The partnership with Brooks, along with a 2-week stint in Continental Championship Wrestling, as he reunited with Tony Anthony as the Dirty White Boys, may have inspired Denton to try something different in Dallas. An attempt to spark a feud with the Fantastics in World Class went nowhere, so Denton changed things up. Leaving the mask behind temporarily, Denton began appearing as Len Denton as part of the new version of the Dirty White Boys with Tim Brooks in late May. The switch in gimmicks got Denton through the summer of 1987, but it was hard times in World Class as the roster was small, and so were most of the crowds. Luckily for Denton, another phone call gave him a new lease in his wrestling life. Rip Oliver made his way back to the Pacific Northwest and was not only wrestling, but serving as Don Owen's assistant. Owen was looking to hire a full-time booker, which he had never had before, and knowing Denton had booked in Kansas City, Oliver recommended him for the job. As most of the territories were at the time, Portland was struggling against the growing machine of the World Wrestling Federation. This was on top of an athletic commission trying to regulate a business they didn't understand, leading to a rule that any time blood was drawn during a match, no matter the reason, the match had to be stopped. In turn, the promotion had to put a no blading rule in place. This was a tough set of rules for a promotion that had thrived on blood feuds. Denton's arrival did give the territory a much-needed shot in the arm, falling back on old-style reliable storytelling, as well as additional training for younger wrestlers like Joey Jackson and Brian Adams. With the National Wrestling Alliance no longer sending their world champion to the territories, Denton also brought in AWA world champion Curt Hennig for defenses in early 1988. In the ring, the Grappler almost immediately went into a series of matches against Pacific Northwest heavyweight champion Mike Miller. Despite the fact Grappler did more than his share of losing to Miller through his first month in the territory, he defeated Miller when it counted in Portland on Halloween night 1987 to win the title. It was the first of 6 Pacific Northwest titles for Grappler, with that first one lasting 279 days for the longest single title reign in the history of the Pacific Northwest Championship. Meanwhile, Grappler and Rip Oliver feuded with Miller and the Assassin, also known as the Cuban Assassin, leading to double bull rope and taped fist matches, quickly becoming the top heel in the territory as well as holding the top championship. Grappler also feuded with Matt Bourne, Tom Zink, and the Southern Rockers Steve Dahl and Scott Peterson. In one of the more memorable storylines, Grappler took a young wrestler named Carl Styles under his wing, for lack of a better phrase. Styles was treated harshly by Grappler, being verbally and physically abused on camera. Styles was blind in his right eye and presented as being a bit slow, building up sympathy with the fans. Eventually, Styles had enough of the way the Grappler treated him and stood up for himself, slapping the Grappler during an interview segment. The Grappler vs. Styles feud heated up when Styles ended Grappler's 5th run with the Pacific Northwest Championship, defeating him for the title on April 1, 1989 in Portland. The two traded the belt back and forth over the next few weeks before the title was held up, but Styles was after more than a belt. In a televised hair versus mask match on May 6, 1989, if Styles lost, he would have his head shaved. If the Grappler lost, he would be forced to remove his mask permanently and never be allowed to wear it again in Portland wrestling. Styles easily outpowered Grappler throughout the match, but Grappler continually took shortcuts like poking his thumb in Styles' good eye to gain an advantage. When Styles kept Grappler in a long, devastating bear hug, Grappler cohort Al Madrill came to ringside and climbed to the apron of the ring. Styles went to confront Madrill, who backed away to avoid Styles. When the referee came over to make Madrill leave the apron, Grappler came up behind Styles and pulled his trunks to roll him up and gain a pinfall. As Grappler celebrated and brought a chair into the ring for Styles to sit on for his head shaving, Styles' friend Beetlejuice came to the ring to tell the referee about the cheating. The ref decided to reverse his decision and continued the match. In a wild moment, the Grappler's mask actually came off during the continued match as he was in Styles' headlock and threw him into the ropes. Styles came back with a clothesline, leaving Grappler stunned and unaware his mask was gone. Styles retrieved the Polaroid camera he had at ringside to take pictures of the Grappler with no mask. Grappler grabbed his mask and struggled to put it back on, blinding himself temporarily as the mask was on crooked. In the mayhem, the referee got knocked completely out of the ring. As Styles again tried to remove the mask, another Grappler ally, Nord the Barbarian, jumped in the ring and clotheslined Styles. The referee recovered and made the 3 count from outside the ring. As the Grappler made a hasty retreat to the locker room, this time Styles went to the interview area where Scotty the Body, who you likely know better as Raven, was waiting with a pair of barber shears to shave his head. Before he could get very far, every babyface wrestler in the locker room dragged Grappler to the area and surrounded him, also sending Scotty the Body running to the back. Portland wrestling owner Don Owen came out to announce the match would be considered a no contest, and Grappler and Styles would have a hair versus mask match with the same stipulations, but this time it would be in a sealed cage to prevent outside interference. Styles won the rematch, meaning the Grappler had to unmask forever in Portland. Continuing to use the name the Grappler, Denton did appear without his mask, though he did make use of some face paint. Angles and storytelling like this kept the Portland fans who were attending highly entertained. As booker, Denton was pulling out as many stops as he could. In October of 1988, Denton arranged a crossover with New Japan Pro Wrestling, losing the Pacific Northwest Championship to Tatsumi Fujinami in Portland, and making a 2-week tour of Japan in December to get the title back. Denton also turned Rip Oliver babyface and aligned him with his longtime rival Billy Jack Haynes, which was an unthinkable scenario in Portland at the time. Even a real-life scenario sounded like a pro wrestling angle when Don Owen actually fired Denton as booker after an incident involving a local TV personality. Owen replaced Denton with Roddy Piper, who immediately hired Denton as his assistant since he was going to be gone doing movies and TV shows. Despite the fact the fans who were still coming to shows were thrilled with the way things were going, Denton or anybody else in the territory couldn't stop outside forces. The primary sponsor of Portland Wrestling on KPTV filed for bankruptcy in 1991. The WWF made an offer to KPTV for the Portland Wrestling time slot, and after 38 years on the air, Portland Wrestling was canceled and taken over by WWF Championship Wrestling. The Portland territory would continue for a while, but the fact of the matter is it wasn't going to last without a presence on television. In July of 1992, Portland Wrestling officially folded, making it one of the last territories to die out. The Grappler and Steve Dahl were the Pacific Northwest Tag Team Champions at the time the territory folded, making them the last. The WWF did make an offer to Len Denton, but his family was happy in Portland, and he had become a part owner with Roddy Piper in a transmission shop called Piper's Pit Stop. Denton turned down the offer and settled into life running a business. Over the next few years, the Grappler did pop up in an occasional independent promotion, and even took a stab at reviving Portland wrestling in 1997, though that would only last a couple of months. Denton did make his way to World Championship Wrestling in 1998, working as Len Denton and jobbing to the likes of Disco Inferno and Jerry Flynn. Denton was even one of Goldberg's early opponents, losing to the Phenom in 53 seconds on an episode of Nitro in Kansas City. To this day, Denton has never really fully retired, continuing to make one-off appearances at indie shows well into the 21st century, and even having a feud with the Grappler 3, who is also known as Eric Baden. The last recorded match I could find was a tag team gauntlet match for Southern Honor Wrestling in Canton, Georgia, as the Grappler teamed with an unknown Grappler number 2 on November 23, 2023. Denton still lives in Oregon, working for Home Depot as a tool technician, and in semi-retirement makes occasional appearances at wrestling conventions, as well as on podcasts and shoot interviews. In 2015, he was recognized with the famed Cauliflower Alley Club as a recipient of the Men's Wrestling Award. As a young man, Denton had aspirations of being a baseball player. That suddenly changed because he got mad. Denton was told he would never make it as a pro wrestler, and 40 years later he was still stepping into the ring as someone that saw the territory days through to its bitter end. An engaging and likable fellow with plenty of stories to tell, the Grappler Len Denton continues to be an ambassador for classic wrestling through interviews and personal appearances. While he never gained the superstar status of a Ric Flair or Hulk Hogan, he is a prime example of what the territory days were all about, and why many of us feel lucky to have been there to see it happen.
Just because I received an injury and I have to wear an orthopedic boot to compete in the sport of professional wrestling, that's okay. Because I know I'm just as tough as any man walking, brother. And don't be making no excuses or saying something about my boot, because I don't want to hear from you or nobody, okay? It offends me. It's an orthopedic boot, and don't worry about it. It's like this right here. They got a name for you when you're the greatest wrestler in wrestling today. They don't call you a great wrestler. They call you the Grappler. Beat me if you can.